Today's video is sponsored by World of Warships. If you've ever wanted to combine your love of history, warships, and let's not forget that need to unleash a massive naval volley into the broadside of your enemy, well, this is the game for you. World of Warships combines the thrill of action and strategic gameplay. You're going to need to not only outgun, but also outthink your opponent. Now, I've been playing this for over a year, and I especially love the idea of how focused the developers are on keeping the ships historically accurate. As you make your way up through the ranks, you'll actually be ascending through the times of the great gunships. And what's more, they're always upgrading the maps, releasing new naval units, and deploying the legendary ships from history. If you sign up now as a new player, you can use the invite code BattleStations2020 and you'll be started with a host of bonus items. And with over 30 million players worldwide, you'll always have someone to go toe-to-toe with. I left a link in the description of the video below, so give it a click and engage in your naval combat experience today. And now for the video you've been waiting for. This video is a collaboration between Flashpoint History and the Alternate Historian. We're going to take a look into one of the most intriguing what-if scenarios in history. That is, what if the Muslims had won at the Battle of Tours in 732, defeating Charles Martel and his army? But first, let's review what really happened. The year was 732. Islamic armies under the Umayyad Caliphate had conquered nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula and had established their new province, known as Al-Andalus. From this new base of operations, they had crossed the Pyrenees and had taken portions of southern France. Their forces began to raid deep into Western Europe in search of more loot. As a result, cities and areas as far as Burgundy would not escape the wrath of the Caliph's men. By the year 732, a new governor of Al-Andalus named Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi had assembled a massive force. With this army, he had overrun the defenders of Aquitaine and in the process had shattered a Frankish army under the command of Duke Odo. With this victory, there was very little military opposition left. The Umayyad commander, now with the initiative, had gone on to ravage the surrounding lands and cities. With the prospect of new plunder, he moved to the northeast. His target was now the city of Tours, where numerous churches and abbeys held a wealth of treasure that was ripe for the taking. But between Poitiers and Tours, a new army under the command of Charles Martel had arrived. It had taken up position on the road, blocking Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi from advancing. While Charles Martel dug in and fortified his position, al-Ghafiqi summoned together his army that was scattered, foraging for food and spoils. Once assembled, the two forces engaged one another as the inevitable confrontation began. Charles Martel had maneuvered his army to block the road to Tours. As he had studied the composition of the Muslim force, he knew they were comprised mainly of cavalry, and thus he could anticipate their tactics. As mentioned before, he had dug in his heavy infantry on a wooded hill at the confluence of the Clain and the Vienne rivers. He then placed Duke Odo and his cavalry to secure his left flank. This formation provided Charles Martel with an excellent defensive position. He was on the high ground, with the rivers securing both of his flanks. Now meanwhile, al-Ghafiqi had divided his forces to better plunder the land and obtain supplies and forage. But on seeing this new force directly in front of him, he hurriedly called on his scattered army to come together. For the next 7 days, the two armies simply faced off. The Umayyad commander sent in a few skirmishing attacks in order to lure the Frankish army off the hill. However, Charles wouldn't take the bait. He kept his well-disciplined men in line, in a classical phalanx formation. With winter approaching, al-Ghafiqi knew that time was running out. Once his entire force had arrived and was assembled, he ordered a broad frontal attack. He sent in his heavy cavalry first. He wanted to use their powerful and much dreaded charge. His horsemen rushed across the open field, but their momentum was drained as they had to both go uphill and then into a forested terrain. And when they clashed into the Frankish front line, they were not able to break through. The Moorish cavalry regrouped and attacked again and again and again, but each time the discipline of the Frankish army showed as they held the line. Eventually, cracks began to develop as the horsemen started to inflict casualties. When Charles saw that his line was beginning to buckle and fall back, he ordered Duke Odo to take his cavalry and race behind the enemy line. The Duke managed to accomplish this and then charged deep into the enemy rear. His goal was not so much to outflank al-Ghafiqi and his men, but rather to attack the Umayyad camp. And keep in mind that this camp was full of the spoils and riches that the Muslims had taken. When al-Ghafiqi's men saw this, they began to break formation. Entire segments of the line began to rush back to their camp. Al-Ghafiqi vigorously attempted to regroup his men and maintain formation, but by that time, it was too late. When Charles Martel saw his enemy's disarray, he rallied his men together and ordered a counterattack. The Frankish army, now with the second wind, came down the hill, gaining momentum as they went. They slaughtered the disorganized opponent in front of them, and in this process, nearly encircled the entire Muslim force. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, commander of the army of the Caliph and governor of Al-Andalus, was caught in the very middle. He was killed on the field of battle trying to rally his men, and with his death, his army collapsed. The Muslim army retreated from Tours and Poitiers, making their way south as the cold of winter approached. Eventually, they crossed the formidable Pyrenees and re-entered Al-Andalus. Islamic Spain would endure for the next 750 years, and indeed, under Abdul Rahman III, the Caliphate of Córdoba would become a powerful state, both militarily and culturally. Meanwhile, Charles Martel gained the respect of all of Europe. He became known as the Hammer, as his victory became known far and wide. He was the man who was regarded as stopping the great Muslim force. In time, Charles would go on to found the Carolingian dynasty, a kingdom that would become extremely powerful in her own right. His grandson, Charlemagne, would become the Holy Roman Emperor, and in 778 would return the favor and invade Al-Andalus. The significance of this battle is still fiercely debated to this day. Some claim it was a fight that simply stopped a major raid, whereas others feel that this was the turning point in the early Islamic conquest, and they go on to say that this engagement basically saved Western Europe and Christendom. But I'll leave it up to my co-host to give you what could have possibly happened.
Thank you, Flashpoint History. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovic, the Alternate Historian. It's true there is a lot of debate among historians about how important the Battle of Tours was to stopping the spread of Islam into Europe. One popular theory among historians, and pretty much any random internet person it seems, is that if the Umayyads were victorious at the Battle of Tours in 732, they would have gone on to conquer all of Europe, ultimately wiping out Christianity on the continent and preventing the rise of our modern Eurocentric present, like Barry S. Strauss predicted could happen in his What If essay, The Dark Ages Made Lighter. Other historians, however, tend to downplay the Battle of Tours' importance and see it as just the end of a raiding expedition that had been blown out of proportion. Alessandro Barbero, while writing for the Global Dispatches, blames French nationalists from the 17th century for this, because they hyped the battle's importance as a turning point in European history, and their propaganda has been repeated by historians and certain politicians ever since. Many Muslim scholars also downplay the Battle of Tours' significance, although to be fair they may be biased since they were on the losing side. Nevertheless, they have instead seen the Umayyad failure to capture Constantinople in 718 as the bigger turning point in Islamic expansion into Europe, which might make for an interesting video, but that is for another day. As for me personally, I'm taking a more moderate view of the battle. While I doubt a defeat at Tours would have seen Christianity being driven out of Europe, I don't think history would have just played out as we know it if the Franks lost. Before I begin to discuss the alternate history, I need to make the Franks lose. Let's say that Charles Martel does not have the foresight to send soldiers to raid the Umayyad base camp during the battle. Or maybe Charles is unable to choose the battlefield because his movements are spotted by the Umayyads, and he is forced to find terrain more advantageous to the Muslim cavalry. Either way, the Umayyads eventually break the Frankish lines, kill Charles Martel, and ultimately sack Tours. So, what happens next? Well, I don't think it's controversial to call the Umayyad army a raiding force that was already far from their base to be easily supplied. Plus, they were not dressed for Northern Europe in October, thus any victory by the Umayyads would end with them returning home with their loot. Nevertheless, a victory at Tours could have led to larger and more frequent raids into Western Europe. In our timeline, early Islamic expansion often began with raids into Christian territories that grew into outright conquest. Additionally, a second and larger Umayyad invasion of France did happen in 735, so in a world where the Muslims were victorious at Tours, it is not implausible to think that they would build on that victory to gain more territory and potential converts. That said, we know that the Battle of Tours was fought not long before the ultimate collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate. In our timeline, a defeat at Tours, along with other issues, such as a Berber revolt in 739, eventually led to the Umayyads being overthrown by the Abbasids in 750. In this alternate timeline, however, a victory at Tours may give the Umayyads an opportunity to deal with internal threats. For example, much of the Umayyad wealth was dependent on booty from conquests and raids. If they had been victorious at Tours, and there had been more raids into France, the flow of wealth might have kept their rivals at bay longer. Then again, other inherent weaknesses of the Umayyad Caliphate, like their Arab-first policies, probably would not be overcome by a single military victory in France, and thus conflicts in the larger Islamic world may postpone any further advance into Western Europe. Still, at the very least, there'd likely be a permanent Muslim occupation of Aquitaine, and Muslim control over Narbonne and Septimania would continue well past the 8th century. Other parts of southern and central France could also come under the control of the Caliphs as well. And what would this Islamic France be like? Well, probably a lot like how Islamic Iberia was in our timeline. Christians and Jews would have to pay a special tax for not being Muslim, but they would be allowed to practice their faiths, although a more fundamentalist Islamic regime may not be so tolerant. Locals would also benefit from being part of the advances in science, medicine, agriculture, and education that Al-Andalus was known for. Islamic France may also have a higher rate of literacy than the rest of France, or Europe for that matter. Andalusian architecture would also spread further north into Europe. Additionally, Al-Andalus was also known for being very tolerant of homosexuality, with many of their rulers openly having male lovers. Such practices would likely spread north into Islamic France as well. That said, Islamic France would also be drawn into the civil wars and other conflicts that Al-Andalus was known for, and it's possible that parts of Muslim France might gain independence, only to be absorbed by local Christian states in some sort of alternate reconquista. If that happened, local Jews and Muslims may be forced to either convert or be expelled, much like what happened in Spain in our timeline. Of course, that is if the Reconquista happens. In 795 of our timeline, Charlemagne established the Spanish March, which was a territory south of the Pyrenees that acted as a buffer zone between Al-Andalus and his kingdom. Fun fact, the modern state of Andorra is the last remnant of this old territory. Anywho, the establishment of the Spanish March was also seen as the first steps in the Reconquista, and if it is delayed, present-day France, Spain, and Portugal might not exist, or else look a lot different than they do today. There may even be a region in Western Europe home to a Muslim majority by the present day. Now that we have looked at what would happen to history from Islam's perspective, let's talk about the Christians. Well, for one thing, Charles Martel dying at Tours could mean his son Pepin never becomes king of the Franks, which also mean his grandson Charles, better known to history as Charlemagne, never becomes king or emperor of the Romans for that matter. Without the Carolingian dynasty, the Merovingian dynasty continues to rule the Franks. Whether they would continue to be ineffectual kings dominated by others, or else be able to exert some authority on their own, is anyone's guess. But I don't think it's implausible to assume they would remain weak rulers, denying Western and Central Europe a strong nation during the early Middle Ages. No Carolingians means that the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of scholarly activity during the 8th and 9th centuries, might not happen. Without the Carolingian Renaissance, the standardization of written and spoken Latin that allowed medieval leaders and scholars throughout Europe to communicate easier could also not happen. With this Tower of Babel style event, who knows how European history would play out? No Carolingians could also mean that the Lombards, who were conquered by Pepin and Charlemagne in our timeline, would remain in power longer in northern Italy and be a considerable threat to the Pope in Rome. Coupled with the expanded Islamic presence in Western Europe, the Pope may have no choice but to move closer to the Byzantine Empire for protection. What could this mean for the rest of Europe? Well, for one thing, the great schism between the western and eastern branches of Christianity may be avoided since the Pope would not want to oppose his protector on religious disputes. Plus, Charlemagne would not be around to fan the flames of religious strife by supporting changes to the Nicene Creed. European paganism may also get a new lease on life. Charlemagne infamously converted the Saxons by the sword, but if there is no strong Frankish ruler to spread Christianity eastward, cultures like the Saxons may stay pagan longer. Who knows? Maybe even the Lithuanians, who converted to Christianity in 1387 and were the last European nation to do so, might still be pagan in the present. No Carolingian dynasty also might mean that Vikings would never be allowed to settle Normandy in exchange for loyalty to the Frankish kings. Without that, the Normans may never exist, thus pushing English history into a completely different trajectory, as Danielle Bainbridge of The Origin of Everything pointed out in her What If video on the Battle of Tours. So yeah, a Christian defeat at Tours probably wouldn't end with the Quran being taught at Oxford like historian Edward Gibbon predicted, but it would lead to enough butterflies flapping their wings that the winds of history would reshape Europe into something very unique. Thus, the outcome of a battle that may have just been a minor raid could still play a part in shaping our present day.